Playoffs are here, week 14 starting tomorrow. But here's wide receiver rankings I have here going into the week. The first guy, who else would it be? Davante Adams. Each and every week, he's the first guy on this list for the wide receiver rankings. Adams here has got another great matchup versus the Detroit Lions, who can't stop nobody in the air. So Adams, I think he'll have a good game again. I could see him getting anywhere from 30 to 40 fantasy points, which he usually does. And him and Aaron Rodgers, I say it each and every week, they're the best quarterback to wide receiver combo possibly in the league. And he just looks for him. In the goal line last week, we even saw it 3 times. He tried getting into Adams, and on the 3rd time, he got him on a fade jump ball for a touchdown versus Philly. So Davante Adams, he's number 1 with a great matchup at Detroit. Number 2, DK Metcalf of the Seattle Seahawks. Metcalf here, this guy's a freak. He's a monster, and no one really could stop him. And this week, he's got a great matchup versus the New York Jets. That receivers just gash. We saw it last week versus the Raiders. Thus, Darren Waller go for 200-plus yards at tight end. And Metcalf, it wouldn't surprise me to see him or Lockett, one of these guys, receive for 200 yards in this ball game. But Metcalf, the better receiver there. He's the number 1 in Seattle. He's more consistent than Lockett. And this week versus the Jets, he's just going to have a huge ball game where I could see him score for anywhere from 30 to 40 fantasy points. Number 3, Tyreek Hill of the Kansas City Chiefs. Tyreek Hill, what a season it's been for him. Last week, he came back to earth a little after having that insane ball game a few weeks ago versus Tampa Bay, where he had 270 yards and 3 touchdowns. But Hill this week, it's a pretty tough matchup versus Miami. Miami gives up the 12th least amount of fantasy points to wide receivers. This ball game's in Miami, but Tyreek with his speed and now his route running ability, this guy's a matchup nightmare. He's so quick. He could take it to the house at any time or burn any defender. And this week versus Miami, it wouldn't shock me to see him have a huge ball game once again. But here I got him at number 3. Number 4, Keenan Allen of the Los Angeles Chargers. This week, he's got one of the best matchups as well. A cupcake matchup versus Atlanta Falcon defense that gives up the most fantasy points to wide receivers. So Keenan Allen, last week, he didn't do nothing, but this Charger team as a whole didn't do anything versus the New England Patriots that had him total lockdown in that 45-0 victory in Los Angeles. But this week's going to be a bounce back. Allen, I could see him have a huge game where he might get double-digit catches in this one and possibly find the end zone. So with this matchup and his ability, he's number 4. Number 5, Calvin Ridley, the Atlanta Falcons. Calvin Ridley now, since he returned with the injured foot, he's had 4 double-digit fantasy games in a row. And Ridley, he's the number 1 really over there, I believe, in Atlanta. It was nice to see Julio Jones come back, but he's still banged up. He's not 100%. And Ridley, he's been cracking 100 yards pretty much each and every week. And this week versus the Los Angeles Chargers, I think he has another huge game. It's another dome game for him. That Charger defense really don't stop anyone. So Ridley, I could see a huge game out of him. He's number 5. Number 6, DeAndre Hopkins of the Arizona Cardinals. Hopkins, he's been struggling the last few weeks. For whatever reason, Kyler Murray's not looking his way. Murray's trying to do too much, and they should just go back to the basics. Throw and catch with Hopkins and Murray like they were early in the season. Hopkins, he was having monster games way earlier in the season, like I said, but now he's not doing much. It's a pretty tough matchup versus the Giants. They got a good defense, decent secondary. James Bradbury, he'll probably be covering Hopkins in this one. And they got to make the cross-country trip. So Hopkins, he's still a top elite receiver in this league, but his consistency has definitely gone down now over the last few weeks, and that's got to do more with Kyler Murray just not looking for him and trying to do things on his own. Number 7, Tyler Lockett of the Seattle Seahawks. Lockett, this guy, he really hasn't done much. He's only had double-digit fantasy points, I think, twice in his last 5 weeks. Lockett, though, this is an amazing matchup versus the Jets, and this is a game where it wouldn't surprise me to see him burst out for 150 to 200 yards in this one. And Lockett, he's that type of receiver that you just got to start him and hope he explodes, because when he explodes and he's on your bench, you're not going to be happy, and you're going to be, losing ball games with a guy like this on your bench. So Lockett, you got to play him each and every week. He's got a great quarterback and a great matchup, and this week I finally think he has a big one. Number 8, Mike Evans of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. The Bucs coming off bye week, and Mike Evans, he's been a touchdown machine over there for Tom Brady and the Tampa Bay Bucs. This week he's got a great matchup versus the Minnesota Vikings that everyone passes on, and receivers score the 4th most amount of fantasy points on. So Evans, I think he finds the end zone again in this one. Maybe he could get his yards up above 70 yards, which he hasn't cracked in weeks, is Evans. But Evans here, he's a touchdown machine, like I said. And this guy, you just got to start him each and every week, and he's got a great matchup. Number 9, Julio Jones of the Atlanta Falcons. Jones last week, he came back with a good ball game. He had 96 yards receiving, and Jones, he's still not 100%. You could tell in that game, you could tell the way he's running routes, but this guy's still a matchup nightmare, and he's got a good matchup versus the Los Angeles Chargers that you could pass on, you could catch on, and you could make plays. And Julio, I think he could get to that 90 to 100 yard barrier in this one and possibly find the end zone. Number 10, Michael Thomas of the New Orleans Saints. Now his 2 out of his last 3 ball games have been good ones for Thomas, cracking 100 yards. But this week, we'll see what he could do with Philly. Philly gives up the 10th least amount of fantasy points to wide receivers. And Taysom Hill, he's been pretty solid, is Hill. But in this game, I could see a run-heavy type of game plan here for the New Orleans Saints. But Thomas is a guy you still got to start each and every week. He's a guy I'm not that high on. He still hasn't found the end zone, I think, in his 3 or 4 games since he returned from injury. But with he's like a Tyler Lockett. It's a guy you can't bench, and a guy he could break out at any time, and you don't want him on your bench when he does. So he's number 10. Number 11, A.J. Brown of the Tennessee Titans. What a run and what some games he's been putting up since he came back from injury. And this week he's got the matchup of all matchups as well versus a Jacksonville Jaguar team that gives up the 5th most amount of fantasy points to wide receivers. A.J. Brown, he's been playing lights out. Last week, we thought he got injured pretty seriously with that ankle injury, but he came back in a game where, honestly, he didn't have to come back. They were getting blown out, but he gamed it out, he toughed it out, and he finished that game with 78 yards receiving. And this week versus Jacksonville, I could see Brown explode and find the end zone maybe twice in this one. Number 12, Justin Jefferson of the Minnesota Vikings. This guy, he just keeps finding the end zone, it seems like, each and every week. And it seems like he keeps finding those 100-yard games. And this week versus Tampa Bay, it's going to be a pretty tough matchup. But this guy's upside and playmaking ability, I cannot have him lower than pretty much 12. This guy's a number 1 receiver over there in Minnesota. I think he's surpassed Adam Thielen, even though Thielen's been great as well. But Jefferson, he's just a matchup nightmare. He's burdened by secondaries, and the thing is, he's a rookie, and he's not all the way up to speed yet. So this is scary. Jefferson, he's a monster, and he's a guy I got at number 12. Number 13, his teammate Adam Thielen. He's having a good season, a lot of touchdowns for Thielen. He's more the underneath guy and go route getter, and him and Jefferson's a great 1-2 combo here for Kirk Cousins and the Minnesota Vikings. But this week, I don't like Cousins pretty much as a matchup. I like Thielen and Jefferson. These are 2 guys you can't bench as well, because if they have breakout games on your bench, you're going to be mad about that. So these guys, I got 12 and 13, and I think they both have solid games, especially if they're trailing early and often Minnesota. I could see these guys get 70, 80 yards and a touchdown each in this one. Number 14, Scary Terry McLaurin. He had a bad ball game last week, was McLaurin, with only 5 fantasy points versus a tough Pittsburgh Steelers defense. And this week the matchup ain't that great as well. He versus a San Francisco 49er team that gives up the 3rd least amount of fantasy points to wide receivers. So McLaurin, he could have trouble in this one. Washington, they were relying on Logan Thomas more than anything in that last game. And McLaurin, though, he's still a top 15 receiver each and every week. But this year I had him ranked number 8, I think, rest of the way in my receiver rankings. Check that out. But this matchup's tough. Alex Smith, you know, he's more of an underneath guy, and he don't stretch the field as much. But I think McLaurin will be fine. Then it wouldn't surprise me to see him have a great bounce back in a huge game. Number 15, Chris Godwin of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Godwin here, he's been solid since he came off his injury with double-digit fantasy points. He's Brady's go-to and underneath guy when he's in trouble. He works the middle of the field and the underneath routes, like I say. And this week he's got a great matchup versus the Minnesota Vikings that give up the fourth most amount of fantasy points to wide receivers. And it wouldn't surprise me to see this game be a shootout and everyone just have huge games. So Chris Godwin, I got him in number 15. Number 16, Deontay Johnson of the Pittsburgh Steelers. You want to talk about a catch machine and a PPR machine. This guy catches a lot of balls, a lot of underneath routes. Ben, he makes sure this guy gets open and he gets him the ball. Last week, he didn't have a great game versus Washington, but once again, Johnson finding the end zone, and he's the number one man over there in Pittsburgh. He's been the most consistent now the last few weeks when he wasn't that consistent, but now they made it an obligation to get him the ball over there in Pittsburgh. A lot of bubble screens, a lot of underneath routes. He could beat you vertical. He runs the route tree. And this week versus Buffalo, it's a tough matchup, but I don't care. He's going to have a good game as Johnson, and he's a guy who's a must-start pretty much each and every week. But the receiver's so stacked this season. There's so many guys, but Johnson, he's the number 2 option each and every week. Number 17, Allen Robinson of the Chicago Bears. Robinson, he's been playing better now since Mitch Trubisky is back in the starting lineup, even though the Bears are still not winning ball games after blowing another one versus the Lions in week 13. But anyway, Robinson, they're testing him deep. He's making the plays. They're getting him the ball. He's finding the end zone. And this week he's got a great matchup versus the Houston Texans that don't stop anybody. So Allen Robinson, I think he's good for 15 to 20 points in this one. So you must play him, and he's number 17. Number 18, Stephon Diggs of the Buffalo Bills. You would say, yeah, Diggs, he's top 5 in fantasy points this year, wide receiver. But this week, there's so many good receivers. There's good matchups, and now the bye weeks are over. So Diggs here, he's got to land in the number 18 spot. Pittsburgh, we know what they do to receivers. We saw last week Terry McLaurin. He got shut down pretty much by that great Pittsburgh defense over there. And Diggs, he had a great game last week versus San Francisco with 10 catches and 92 yards. And now this week versus Pittsburgh, those numbers are going to go down. I could see a mediocre ball game for Diggs in this one, and we'll see what he could do. But Diggs, I got him here in number 18. Number 19, Robby Anderson of the Carolina Panthers. And he's the last man standing over there for this Panthers offense. Curtis Samuel and DJ Moore, they went on the COVID list, and I don't know if these guys are going to come back in time for this ball game versus Denver. This is a good matchup for Anderson. Anderson's got double-digit fantasy points in 10 out of his 12 fantasy games this season. So Teddy Bridgewater, he relies on Anderson a lot. This guy, he's improved over the last year now. He's not just a deep ball threat. This guy can run the routes. He can burn you deep, cross the middle, slants, everything. So Anderson, he's improved. He's playing for a contract. And this week he's got a great matchup, and he should be the number 1 receiver over there this week in Carolina. So he's number 19. Number 20, Robert Woods of the Los Angeles Rams. This guy's a great possession receiver. Jared Goff believes in him, and he's the number 1 over there as well. Cooper Kupp, he's been inconsistent too much, where Woods, he's the guy there, and I trust him more. So Woods versus New England, he might have Stephon Gilmore on him this week, which is going to be a tough matchup. But this guy, he's still a guy you got to start, especially with the playoffs here. The guys you drafted early, you got to play them, man, no matter what, unless they're totally horrible this season. But Robert Woods, I still think he has a solid game, and he's a guy you must start. Number 21, Amari Cooper of the Dallas Cowboys. He has a great matchup this week versus the Cincinnati Bengals, but the problem is, can Andy Dalton get him the ball consistent? Last night, we saw Cooper have a great touchdown in the back of the end zone that pretty much saved his fantasy day. I believe he finished with 14 or 15 points is Cooper. And Cooper, obviously, if he had Dak Prescott, this guy's pretty much a top 15 option each and every week. But with Andy Dalton in there in the lineup, the numbers go down, obviously, across the board. But Cooper's still a solid number 2 receiver for fantasy. He's put up double-digit fantasy points in 10 out of his 12 games this season. So he's reliable. He's worth the money that they gave him in the offseason. And this guy, he's one of the best route runners in all of football. Number 22, Cooper Kupp of the Los Angeles Rams. I just mentioned Kupp a few moments ago, that he's been inconsistent. He could have a huge game, and then he could have a dud game where he has 3 or 4 fantasy points. And this week versus New England, I think it'll be an in-between game for Cooper Kupp, where 10 to 15 points he could get in PPR leagues, because Stephon Gilmore, I believe, will be on Woods. Kupp, then he'll work the underneath routes and the short routes in this game. And that's what Jared Goff and the Rams got to do in tomorrow night's game, is feed Kupp early and often, I believe, versus New England. And this guy, he's a number 2 to flex receiver option, so he's 22. Number 23, Chase Claypool of the Pittsburgh Steelers. He's got a tough matchup at the Buffalo Bills, but in my opinion, he's the second guy over there in the pecking order. Juju Smith-Schuster, he gets a limited amount of catches, it seems like 3 or 4 a game, where Claypool, he's the deep ball threat, he's the vertical threat, and he's the guy that opens up the field. And this game at Buffalo, it's going to be a great one, a great AFC matchup this weekend. And Claypool, I could see him break a deep one in this game and find the end zone once again. Last week, he had a mediocre game versus Washington, but that was a defensive battle and a dogfight to the end. But Claypool, I like him here as a number 2 receiver. And at 23, number 24, Tyler Boyd of the Cincinnati Bengals. Boyd, he was on his way to an insane ball game last week before he got tossed punching a Miami Dolphin player in the face. He had a 72-yard touchdown, was Boyd. And this week, he's got a dream matchup versus the Dallas Cowboys, that everyone has a big game. We saw the Ravens last night do whatever they wanted versus the Cowboys, and I think Cincinnati, to a certain extent, could do the same thing in this game. And Tyler Boyd, Cowboys, they don't have anyone that could guard him. He's going to have a big game. I think he could find 100 yards and possibly the end zone in this one is Tyler Boyd, so I like him here at 24. Number 25, Corey Davis of the Tennessee Titans. This guy, he's been exploding on the scene of late, and last week he had an insane ball game. Was Corey Davis last week in a game where they were down, so they had to throw a lot. So Davis, he just went off, and like I say each and every week, the attention, it's not on Davis. He's going to be single covered each week. Last week, 11 catches, 182 yards, and a touchdown, which was good for 35 fantasy points. I don't think Davis will get 35 this week, but I could see 15 to 20. He's got the great matchup versus Jacksonville. Give up the 5th most amount of fantasy points to wide receivers. But Corey Davis, what a season it's been. And he's, like I said, it's Henry Brown and him. So defenses, they can't stop everybody. And of late, they haven't stopped Davis. He's got double-digit fantasy points now in 6 out of his last 7 games. So this guy, he's pretty much a must-start at your number 2 a flex receiver spot each and every week. Number 26, T. Higgins of the Cincinnati Bengals. It's a great matchup again for Higgins. The only thing, he's banged up. He got banged up at the end of that Miami Dolphin game last week. Higgins does. He's got the Dallas Cowboys. I think he'll have a good ball game, is Higgins. And I won't be surprised if he could find the 100-yard barrier in this one and find the end zone. Number 27, Brandon Cooks of the Houston Texans. He's the number 1 guy over there in Houston, but Kiki Cootie put up those number 1 numbers last week, but I still can't have Cootie ahead of Cooks in the pecking order. It was a great game for Cootie, but it was only a one-time thing, and we'll see if he can do it again this week. Cooks, it's a tough matchup versus Chicago, but he's a guy, you got to play him if you need a guy at the flex, or if you play 3 receivers in your league. He's been putting up double-digit points. So Cooks, he's good for 10 to 15 pretty much each and every week, and that's not a bad guarantee for a guy who's in a pretty good offense with a good quarterback, obviously. So he's number 27. Number 28, Juju Smith-Schuster here. He's got a good ball game coming up versus the Buffalo Bills. Each week, this Pittsburgh offense, you don't know who's going to have a good game, but Smith-Schuster, he's a guy you still should start at your flex and number 3 position at wide receivers. So Smith-Schuster, wouldn't surprise me if he has a 100-yard game or a 40-yard game, but he's a guy, just like I said about Lockett and some of these other receivers, you really can't bench him, because if he breaks out and has a huge game, you're going to be kicking yourself. Number 29, Kenny Galladay of the Detroit Lions. I don't know if he's going to play or not, is Galladay. This guy, he's been out now for multiple weeks with that hip injury. So hopefully Galladay could get healthy and get on the field, because he's going to have a decent matchup versus the Green Bay Packers. I know Jair Alexander most likely will be on him, but Galladay, he could get open, he can make plays, and he's a top receiver, top 15, top 20 guy when he plays. But the problem with him the last few seasons, he just can't find the field, it seems like, for Galladay. But if he plays, he's 29. If not, Marvin Jones will be the number one receiver over there and the guy getting most of the targets and the work. And the 30th and final guy, a wide receiver here in the rankings, is Deebo Samuel of the San Francisco 49ers. Samuel, he had a decent game versus Buffalo. They used him as a gadget guy. And this week, he's got a decent matchup versus Washington. But this Washington defense, they make you earn every yard and they make you fight for it. And this week, I could see him be limited a little in this game. With Washington, they're going to zone in on Samuel and try to stop him. But Samuel, I still think he's a good start this week. But there's so many receivers that are good and have great matchups that Samuel, I had to rank him 30th here. So that's the top 30 wide receivers I'm ranking here heading into week 14.